And thank you so much for being here and for showing such interest in these paintings of California. It's really heartening, and when I heard that this collection was coming all the way to North Carolina, I was surprised. So the downstream, as was just mentioned, really, it's remarkable because, you know, when the principal of Gardena High School decided to put this collection together, he had no idea what was really going to happen. Mm-hmm. And it really transformed a whole community. And you'll see that. Hopefully we'll get to the end. If I don't talk too much, we'll get to the end of this presentation, and you can see some of the outcomes of what did happen. However, one of the things that was unfortunate is this collection ended up in a closet for years. And nobody even, when I first started this project, I went to the principal at Gardena High School. This was about 2014, to interview her. And she said it was a mystery no one knew about. There was not a teacher on the campus that could tell me anything about it, that knew anything about it, and she didn't know anything about it really either. So that's what happens when you take paintings off the wall and put them in a closet. This marvelous story was no longer known. And it was the effort of this Gardena High School Art Collection Board that really brought the story out and has made the collection come alive again. So alive that it's here in North Carolina, so thank you. Well, I just wanted the photograph that you see there on the, I guess it's on your left, is of the art banquet in 1941. And on the left is one, and that's 13 years after the collection was started. And the painting on the right is by John Frost of A Desert Scene. And those two things say a lot about the Gardena High School art collection, because it ended up being a community event. And as you can see, it was a big community event, even in 1941, which was the year that we entered the war. So this was the last big year for quite a while as they started cutting back. But, so So in 1919, the high school principal, John Whiteley, he embarked on this program that he thought would be helpful to this community of students that was in a very undeveloped part of Los Angeles, that would help their cultural foundation, because they were largely the children of farmers, and it was an agricultural community. So he thought that by having this collection, having works of art on the campus, that it could serve as a way of, across disciplines, teaching the students. So English people, English teachers could come in and have them write essays, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he wanted them to have direct engagement with original works of art. And he wanted to cultivate an environment that created dialogue and that fostered creativity and that promoted interdisciplinary learning. Very much like a university art collection, which is meant to provide students with a way of learning across disciplines. But it became even much more than that. As you can see, it became something that the whole community had to be involved in. But the place that, here's some good photographs of what it was like back then. It was, like I said, it was a community that was a third Japanese American farmers, a third Hispanic, and a third of white farmers as well. And in the northeast, the southwest corner of Los Angeles, very low population density, a diverse populace, and a smaller wealth base than other parts of the city. And even by 1940, the population was still only about 6,000 residents. So you can see that it was still not a very big area of Los Angeles even then. You can see there was oil derricks in the background at that time. But, you know, so how did this come about? How did this incredible collection come about in this high school with those kinds of challenges? So it really had to do with Principal Whiteley, John Whiteley. He was the new principal in 1919. He was brought on. And it was his idea. So from 1919 to 1956, the students collected 2 works of art a year. There was a summer and a winter group. Because it was a farming community, a lot of the students couldn't work all year. So some of them had to cut out at a certain point to work in the fields. So some of the summer students raised $400 for a painting, and the winter students raised $300 for a painting. And they did that by having teas, doing plays, anything that they could think of, you know, but mostly class plays in the beginning. And eventually they had a banquet dinner, which you saw a photograph of in the beginning. And over the years, the artists gave these students huge breaks in the prices of the paintings. So what they bought the painting for $400 was really a $4,000 painting, let's say. And if you look at what $4,000 was then, it still probably doesn't match up to what the painting is today, but it will give you some idea. But also, some other people donated works of art to the collection. The federal art projects did. We're mostly going to concentrate on the ones that the students bought. There is a really big, beautiful painting that was a donation. That's the largest painting in there, which was a mural that was donated to the campus. So you might take a look at that, by Eleanor Colbert. And then in 1923, believe it or not, they built a new school auditorium which doubled as an art gallery. And throughout Los Angeles, it was called the Gardena High School Art Gallery. It was literally meant to house a permanent collection. And because of that, that's why these artists, who were the most well-known artists at the time, were willing to donate the paintings. Well, it was almost like a donation, right? Really. They were willing to give these huge price breaks because they knew this was going to be a permanent collection on view throughout time. That's how they saw it. So that's how this was able to happen. So what was Gardena High School like, though? Well, it was a vocational learning school. And that's because at the time that the high school kind of came together, it was during the arts and crafts movement in the United States, when vocational learning was really big, and also hands-on learning. So the school had this interesting holistic approach to learning, using hands-on teaching methods. So they, of course, had huge agricultural fields where the students worked in the fields. They taught English, Latin, mathematics, science, all the usual subjects, but also wood turning and carving, cooking and sewing, carpentry, forging, printing, and pattern making. All of those things were taught. And that was not only to build character, because that's what they saw it as then, a way to build character, but it was also a practical approach for a lot of these people who were going to be going into the farming industry, but maybe they also won't want to do that. And then they will have learned something else that they could do by working in one of the places on campus. And as you can see, there's a farming image on the top. So there's the farming. The middle, that was I think that was where they learned to do forging. And then on the bottom, see that truck? The students built that truck out of spare parts. And that truck figures large later on in the story, so take a good look. Well, the girls, of course, they weren't expected to be farmers. They were expected to be farmers' wives, right? It's just the way it was. So they were groomed that way. So they took practical courses in home economics. They also ran the cafeteria, believe it or not. They did the cooking and the serving, and the food was all grown on the campus. Yes, very unusual. What would have influenced the students' choices? It's kind of interesting. You have to realize that the students really were making the choices. And these are some of the current events that the students went through during the time they were in school, over the years from 1919 to 1956. Gardena High School suffered through first World War I, the 1918 flu pandemic, and some of their classmates died in both of those events. Then the Great Depression, they went through that. And then World War II, where again they had some of their school chums go off and die in World War II. And when a third of the student body was sent to internment camps. And these were their friends, these were their close friends. You know, there really was a mixture because they all were in school together since 6th grade. So this was a school that went from 6th grade through high school. So these kids were together for all those years. So it was a difficult time for them when that happened. But this is the first painting that they chose. This was a much older artist. So he was 20 years at least older than somebody like William Wendt. And he died quite early on as well. Well, in 45 he died. Ralph Davidson Miller, class of 1919. He was very proud of being the one that kicked off this program. And to me, this really kind of represents the moodiness of it, sort of the sadness of it, kind of represents some of what I think the students were probably feeling at that time. They felt the weight of the world on their shoulders. And how do I know this? Because I read the yearbook. I read through the yearbooks. And the yearbooks expressed all these really interesting things. Like the students felt the weight of the world because they're graduating now, they're going to be going out into the world, and they're going to have to enact some kind of change. So it was a difficult time. What other things influenced their selection now? Well, the fame of an artist. So the great thing is that these artists went in small groups up to this area of Los Angeles called the Arroyo Seco that was on a river. And it was a little bit less developed, and it had been an arts and crafts community, a bohemian arts and crafts community, sort of the countercultural artists and writers and people of the day lived up there. And that's where all these hot artists of the time lived. So the students got to go up in these small groups and visit these actual living artists and see them at work. Well, maybe they weren't really working, but got to see, a painting on the canvas and what it looked like if you were what an artist studio looked like, what their houses looked like, what it was like to be an artist. How many of us get to do that? So they also, some of that would kind of rub off on them. Wow, I got to meet so-and-so. We should really choose his painting, that kind of thing. So they got to rub shoulders with prominent artists in Los Angeles. And then later on, there was a banquet, which I'll talk about. And they got to then host the artist in their own school later on at the banquet. So, for example, John Mannheim, they visited him, they bought 3 paintings for him because he was right there in that area. And he was such a welcome host, He was happy to have them come. He would show them everything. And he was also an artist whose wife had died. And he was there with 2 young children, 2 young girls that he was raising on his own. So they probably felt, they would get to know these people a bit and get to know their story. And I think that also influenced their choices. But again, John Mannheim was one of the great artists of the day at that time there. This one, I think some of you already know this story, but Jack Wilkinson Smith was already very nationally well known at the time when the students visited him in probably 1922, 23, because he'd done sketches on the battlefield during the Spanish-American War that were published across the country and in all the top magazines and everything. So he was very well known as an artist. And so when they visited his studio, this unfinished painting was on the easel. And apparently the students sort of got into a huddle over to the side and talked among themselves, with the teacher kind of going, "What's going on here?" And then the class president walked over to the artist and said, "We have $200. Will you take it?" And the teachers, like, wait a second, this is it was totally not supposed to happen that way, because the students would recommend a painting, and then it would go back to the school so that the whole senior class would have a chance to vote among these paintings. So she was probably a little nervous about that, this kind of irregular thing that happened. But, it worked out in the end. I'm sure it was fine. So there you have it, this beautiful painting of early spring up in the mountains by Jack Wilkinson Smith. Here's another reason why, another painting that was chosen probably for very different reasons. So this is of a young woman named Señorita Luzuriaga, or the Brass Bowl. And it's by John Hubbard Rich, who was a member of a modernist group in Los Angeles, a small group of 8 modernists. And during the year that this painting was painted, a very important New York painter was in Los Angeles and was influencing the scene. And that was Robert Henry, who some of you may know. He was the founder of sort of the whole modernist movement from around 1908 on, in the early days. So he also sort of started this regional direction in Los Angeles and in Southern California to paint the ethnically diverse population of California. And that's kind of what this painting represents, but it also represents a Hispanic woman. And of course that would appeal to the people at Gardena High School, right? It's like their people. So I'm sure that that's why they did it, because it was somebody from looked like somebody from their community, but also because it was a painting in a very important exhibition. And so it had some cachet as well. And you can see this artist had studied in Boston with Edmund Tarbell, who was a major American Impressionist. And you can see that reflected in the background mostly. And it's a quiet painting of a woman in contemplation. And whereas here in California, it's a woman contemplating a brass bowl, in almost kind of a feeling of a ritual quality. In Boston, it would have been a woman dressed in her finery reading a book. So it's a very California version of that kind of a subject matter. Here are just some paintings that I think everybody can agree are just beautiful. So the Franz Bischoff, A Cool Fog Drifting, that's of a beautiful place in Carmel that I love, and I thought I should show you that one because I just think it's a wonderful painting. It's of Point Lobos, a very famous place where a lot of artists and photographers have worked. And then on the right is the handsome Puddoff, Hills of Majesty. So Puddoff was very important. So the other thing about the Arroyo Seco that you need to know about why these people would go there is that California plein air painting started in the Arroyo Seco around 1905, around 1900. The other thing that the Arroyo Seco became known for were artists that painted the history and culture of California. And so we'll see some of those paintings too. So it was all about the West, because the West was something new to people in other parts of the country. So it's like these artists were describing what it was like in the West or the Southwest for the rest of the country. And they did that through landscape. They did it through visiting the Native American places that were still, that had living Native Americans. And they did it through going to the missions, for example, and painting the ruins of the missions and the ruins of some of the ranchos. So California had a very different history. It wasn't like the East at all. And so people really had no idea what it was really like. And so this was exciting, not only to the artists that came from New York, that came from Europe and came from all over and moved there, because they came from other places, right? There was maybe only one artist in California that was actually born there, that's in the show, and that was Maynard Dixon. So Puthoff was hailed as this quintessential Western artist painting en plein air. And he was compared to sort of the academic style of the East, and how this was authentically West, and this direct engagement with the landscape. On the left, the left is Edgar Payne's Rockbound from 1921, and Edgar Payne didn't do that many seascapes, so this is kind of a rare seascape as well. And he founded the Laguna Beach Art Association, which became the Laguna Beach Art Museum, where I worked for many years. And then on the right, you see Carl Oscar Borg. And he's one of those artists that was interested in painting the West. And he became very well known for paintings of the Native Americans. Because he was commissioned by the US government to do that, to go and to make paintings that would kind of preserve the culture of the Hopi and Navajo Indians. He did that for many years, and he actually had his ashes sprinkled in the Grand Canyon when he died, because he lived for half the year in the Grand Canyon area. He really bonded to that part of the country. Well, of course, William Wendt was probably the most well-known of these artists, and is really considered the dean of California Impressionist painting. So in the beginning, when the artists in the Arroyo Seco were painting, they were painting en plein air, they were painting outdoors, but they weren't Impressionists. They didn't think of themselves as Impressionists. They weren't called Impressionists. There was no California Impressionism, really, in the beginning. But around 1915 in California, when there was the Panama Pacific International Exposition, then there was a large showing of French and American Impressionists. And so these people that were painting en plein air, they began to change the way that they approached the color and the light in their paintings. And something that was more impressionistic developed, beginning around 1915. And so by the time we're in 1919, some of these artists were doing that, and some of them still weren't. Like that first painting you saw by the artist, that wasn't Impressionist at all. That was more of a tonalist painting, which was when they would paint with a very limited number of colors, in a very limited, not much difference in value between the colors, so that there wasn't a lot of contrast. And it was more of a tonalist aesthetic that began to develop towards California Impressionism. And by the 20s, we really did have something that was more like a California Impressionist movement. So the thing about William Wendt that's so interesting is that he was a very spiritual person, and he tried to express that through his paintings. Not all of the artists had that sort of thought in mind when they were painting, but he loved to use a lot of green, and he would go into canyons mainly. And Laguna Beach was surrounded by canyons, and that's where he did a lot of his work. We're in these canyons where there was a very narrow space. And so you can see that he's showing several different layers of the landscape. So we have the foreground where you have trees, then there's a middle ground of hills, and then behind that there's a bigger hill, a small mountain even. But he's kind of painted them all almost with the same depth of field, which is not the way a lot of those painters did it. He's not really a California impressionist in that sense. He didn't use, at least in this painting, he's not using that effect of trying to show the distance by painting that mountain in the background sort of a purple, or showing atmospheric perspective. He's kind of trying to bring it up to create a feeling of both monumentality and also intimacy, I feel, so that you're in the landscape, but he's still creating a feeling of God's immanence. I don't know if you can see that, but anyway. So William Wendt was very much behind the collecting program, always in touch with Principal Whiteley, and sent several letters to the school. And this was one that he sent in 1931 when he couldn't send a painting to the school. He felt bad, but he was going to have a major exhibition at Stendhal Galleries, and he needed all of his paintings for that show. So he sent a letter, and this is one of the things he said. "It is gratifying to me that the students of your school show a lively interest in art. It will help them to appreciate the beauties in nature. May the good work continue." Now, isn't that interesting? That the paintings would help the students to enjoy nature. But it's true. It's true. I think the students becoming more involved in looking at these works of art, it might help them to see nature, outside of what they were probably used to, which was as a farming community would be looking at it. So Principal Whiteley kept a lively correspondence up with several of the artists. And later on, when they started the art banquet and the exhibition, it was important that he kept sending them letters himself to invite them to participate, because these were some very, very important artists, and they needed that kind of special touch. So what happened? What happened is that in 1928, in addition to sending the students off to these artist studios and maybe one exhibition at the museum, they would take students to one exhibition at the museum and to artist studios. Hanson Puthoff gave them this idea to try to do an art banquet and an exhibition instead, because it was getting difficult for the students to go pick up all the art. And but it became even more difficult when they decided to invite 100 artists to participate in an exhibition. So that's what happened. They started in 1928 was the first year. They started inviting 100 regional artists to submit a work for an exhibition at the school. And so they had this exhibition for 3 weeks. It was hung in the school library and in that big study hall art gallery. And the students, again, acted as hosts. They served the meal, they cleaned up, some of them cooked the meal. It was a wonderful annual event that many of the prominent artists attended. And there were speakers and musical offerings, so they would have somebody important in the art world come and talk. They also had a toastmaster who was one kind of well-known artist. He would toast the other artists, which made it kind of exciting, because then you got to know the inside story of these people. And so that was right before the Depression hit, though, right? So then the Depression hits. So what happened is the Gardena community, in order to keep it going, they decided to have this art association. And the art association helped out to put on the banquet and to have the banquet and the exhibition. And there were some lists of the groups and the people that it took to put this whole thing on, and it took from 500 to 800 people every year to do this. Students, parents, and people in the community. And all these groups came from outside of Gardena and had teas there. So that's how the students made money. They made money by, you paid for the banquet dinner, and then if your organization, like the Japanese clubs across Los Angeles, they all came. The Pacific Art Association came, the Wednesday Progressive Club, all these social clubs would come. They'd have their annual meeting there. The students would serve them tea. The people would look at the art, but they would also pay something for this tea. So that became another way for them to raise the money during the Depression, because there was kind of an outcry in the community, you know, why is this continuing when people are starving, you know? Because there were, you know, thousands and thousands of people pouring into the area from the rest of the country looking for work at that time. And it was a very, it took the community to say, no, this is important, we need to keep it going. So the purchase price exhibits were really impressive, and the chief art critic of the Los Angeles Times covered them, usually 2 or 3 times each year. You know, it's coming up, it's here, it's going to close, here's the best painting, etc. Even national publications like the Christian Science Monitor covered these exhibitions. And it was a primary way for artists to show their work until the 1950s. And that's partly because the Depression closed down a lot of galleries. So some of these artists depended on showing during that era. And you can see there were some that were truly impressionists, like Clarence Hinkle's Quiet Pose. That's one of the paintings that really feels more like, almost like an American Impressionist painting. And then Maurice Braun's California Hills on the right is very much a California Impressionist painting. And he was a San Diego painter. There were some artists outside of Los Angeles that showed. It was, you know, they started drawing people from Northern California and San Diego and that kind of thing. And so it really became something that really showed what was happening in California across the board. This is my favorite photograph because it really shows what it was like at Gardena High School. So look at the beautiful library that they built for the students. Can you imagine a public school having that now? Isn't that just gorgeous? Now the paintings that you see on the wall, that's how they would hang the annual art exhibit. That's not how they would hang the collection itself. They would put little lights above each painting so that each painting got proper lighting, because remember, it was mostly an evening activity. So it would be dark without those little lights. And the Board of Education actually paid for those for the Gardena High School. And this just showed up in this sketch, the one book that we found, one Gardena High School scrapbook that kind of came up at the same time that we started working on this. There was this photograph in there, and it really shows the complexion of the student body and what the school was like and what the annual exhibit was like. And it also told us what year the photograph was taken by the painting in the corner. I recognized that painting in the corner above to the left of the door was an annual purchase price painting. This painting is that painting there. So that dated it as being 1933, because that's when that painting was bought. And this was one of the worst years of the Depression. Bread lines were forming all over Los Angeles. 10,000 transients were coming into Los Angeles every month. looking for work. And then 350,000 farmers and their families flooded in an epic migration. I mean, Los Angeles was being hit heavily, and also Gardena. So you can tell that this was sort of an oasis in the middle of that for the students, I think. They probably felt like they were being well taken care of, I think, at this school. And I think you feel that, but you can see that there's some of them are maybe talking a little bit, but there's a feeling of harmony, I think, in that library that I really like. And it's just beautifully designed with the high ceilings, and they designed it so that there was enough room for a lot of paintings above the bookshelves. So this is what the students selected, the winter class selected. And they didn't have the funds to purchase it right away. They weren't able to buy it until December. Usually the students already had the money soon after the banquet dinner, because they made some of the money at the banquet dinner. This year they didn't, because it was such a difficult time. But I think this was one of the years when the community also came together and they did some kind of a play. The parents and the teachers did some sort of and the community did some sort of a play that was more of a comedy that people wanted to come see. Wanted to come see these people act silly. And so they were able to buy the painting eventually. So, but we're in new territory now, right? With the Depression, California Impressionism really became obsolete about this time in terms of people painting that way. Because as a sign of the times, culture and change was so much on the horizon. And Southern California was pretty developed at this point. And now we had all these people pouring in, thousands of people pouring in. Art just began to reflect other concerns due to, the difficult economic and social circumstances. So artists began to reflect the world around them, its culture, people's rural and urban life. And you can see that also art began to affect them. So, on the left we have sort of something that's like a Midwestern American scene painting, like Thomas Hart Benton, for example. People began to do these rural paintings of rural times when, kind of looking back at a time when things were easier. But that would have appealed to the students for a different reason, right? Because it kind of reflected their own community, which was also a rural farming community. And then Robert Clooney, the one on the right, that's interesting. It's just a really good painting because it's not even of California. It's of Saginaw, Michigan. But what's wonderful about it is you can see that little dog. There's a lot of narrative in this painting. You can see there's a little dog walking across that bridge over to the places where those people are, and somebody reading a newspaper. So these were actually people that lived kind of in these riverboat houses on the edge of a river. And again, these were people that were suffering during the Depression and didn't have a real home, but they were able to build these makeshift places along the river in Michigan. So it's kind of a Depression era image, but has a very happy feel to it, and a sort of a storytelling aspect of it that would have really appealed to the students. Maynard Dixon was an artist that after the 1906 earthquake, he was a San Francisco artist, but like many San Francisco artists, around 1906, when the big earthquake happened and then basically the city burned to the ground, then artists had to leave San Francisco. And they went down to Los Angeles, a lot of them. Maynard Dixon was one of those who started spending time in the Arroyo Seco. And he ran into, there were these artists, like I said, that were interested in painting Native Americans and that sort of thing. So that's when he started doing that. And around 1900 is when he made his first trip to a Native American settlement. And this is one of those paintings that you just wonder how Maynard Dixon could give this up for such a small amount of money. But I would guess that these artists had been trying to get one of these paintings for years. Because you see, it was really it really was a thought out, well orchestrated collection. It was curated in a certain sense. So they knew the artists that they wanted to collect. They kept inviting them. They kept hoping for that right painting by that particular person. And as you notice, there's not much repetition. So they, it might come that there would be a painting by somebody that they really wanted a painting by them, but it wasn't exactly the right painting because it was too much like something else. So they, they were trying to get the right paintings by the right people. And here they finally got their Maynard Dixon, which is a really exceptional painting by him, because this is what he was best at. And even though he painted that in 1931-32, it didn't come into the collection until the war period. And that might be because Maynard Dixon, by that point, was a fairly old guy. He wasn't a spring chicken anymore. And they were able to get this painting then. And also, a lot of the young men were off at war, and that left a lot of women back at the high school making the decisions finally. So it's also when paintings by women artists started entering the collection, which is kind of funny. Anyway, so this is sort of Maynard Dixon's mature work. It's one of the iconic paintings in the collection. I think a lot of people's favorite. And you see how you can see two sides of Maynard Dixon. He was able to paint these beautiful modernist landscapes, and then he's just juxtaposed it with this really sensitive portrayal of the Native Americans that he knew in that part of Utah where he lived. He lived in that part of Utah where this was painted for a good deal of the year by that point. This is a painting that has a good story. Remember that truck that I told you to take a look at? So some of you have already heard this story, I'm sorry. But what happened is I was doing all this research in the newspaper and noticed that the painting that was bought by Charles L.A. Smith by the class of winter 1934 wasn't the painting that we had. And I was like, well, what happened? And then just by sheer luck, a woman who had gone to Gardena High School and who had been involved in trying to keep the collection, keep the collection going, she sent me a plastic bag, grocery bag full of stuff. And amongst this stuff that I just had no idea why she was sending it to me was an email from somebody that she had gotten in the 90s or something. And it said, okay, I'm the one who was driving the truck when the painting flew out of the truck. I was only going 35 miles an hour, but yes, I was the one driving the truck, and and then I knew they had to get a replacement. And so this was the replacement. And I guess, I kind of wondered, a painting could fly out and just disappear completely, right? Surfboards do that. We've had surfboards fly off the top of our car, and we're like, where'd it go? Well, so anyway, this is called Monterey Pines, when in fact it's really actually cypress trees that you mostly see, but that's okay. It shows a road leading through the pine and cypress forest in Pebble Beach, down to the shoreline, where Samuel F.B. Morse III had opened a golf course in 1925. And you can't see it unless you get up close, but there's golfers and sand traps. You can kind of see a sand trap, right? See that little, yeah. You can see a sand trap, and there's golfers down there golfing. And I just love this painting, anyway. So And plus, it's a gorgeous painting. I bet it's better than the one that they lost. This is what Gardena High School looked like in 1935 when they were on a WPA project to clean up the campus. I think it kind of shows you, the kind of grandeur and beauty of the campus later on. At first it was that sort of neoclassical look, and now we have this beautiful modernist look. So, okay, so this is really the most interesting part. So, in addition to their visit to artist studios and to the art banquet and to all of that, they took a required class called Senior Problems, which devoted weeks of instruction to learning how to make a selection and to prepare them for that selection. And it was required for graduation. You couldn't not take the class. You had to pass it. So they attended talks. So for those 3 weeks that all of the paintings were there were certain things they did then, but they did other things during the year to prepare them for when the paintings came. So they attended talks by artists and critics. They, it seems to me that they somehow, through the teachers' influence, they sort of would select maybe 10 paintings that they did this intensive look at, right? Because they couldn't do it with all 100 paintings. So I think that they narrowed it down to a certain number, maybe even only 10. And they would look at them closely to perceive not only things about color and draftsmanship, but other aspects of art. So we know they probably, they also probably looked at them in terms of their subject matter and what might appeal to them for all those other reasons we already talked about, right? Senorita Lizuriaga, for example. But they looked at light and shade, composition, centers of interest, and other aspects such as the vibration of colors next to each other, all the sort of formal aspects of art. They had these paintings there for 3 weeks, so they were exposed to them, and they had intensive classes in the areas of the paintings. And so English students were sent over to write some essays. I read some essays by some of these people. They were told to imagine what it would be like if a fire struck Gardena High School and the paintings were all going to burn. It was terrible to read. It was like nightmarish essays, really. So it was a collaborative project of weeding out the choices. And I still think they probably helped them weed it down to a reasonable number, like maybe 20 or 10 or something like that. And until a majority consensus was reached. But it wasn't always easy, and there was discord, and students would come home and complain to their parents and ask them for what they thought. And families got involved. The boys went against the girls. It was, there was a lot of discord sometimes until they could get it down. So that was also a good lesson, wasn't it? A lesson in how to come to a consensus throughout that. This isn't one of the last paintings that I'll talk about deeply because we don't have much time, probably, I'm gonna guess. So this painting was selected in 1943, Jesse R. Spotke's Cranes Under a Giant Fern, probably one of the best paintings of this size that this artist ever painted. It's a beautiful painting. The background is 22 karat gold leaf, and it recalled, this artist drew upon Buddhist and Shinto screens, Japanese screens, in the making of these kinds of paintings. So, and those Buddhist and Shinto screens date from the Edo period, from like 1615 to 1868, more or less. So they weren't something that was currently being done in Japan. But they usually depicted cranes in these garden settings. So she was really drawing very directly from Japanese art, but in her own manner. And the crane symbolized longevity and immortality. And this was the painting that the students selected while their Japanese friends were off at the internment camps. And I think it was really a tribute to the students that were missing. And apparently what young people were doing in the internment camps was they were doing origami cranes. They were folding origami, it breaks my heart. They were folding origami cranes as a way of hoping that it would, heal people in Japan, heal themselves, heal their families, and very touching. And it's on the cover of the catalog. This was also a painting that has a lot in it. So a lot of these students some of them probably came up during what was the Bracero, the federal Bracero program. And that was when the federal government invited Mexican temporary workers into the U.S. to fill a labor shortage in agriculture from 1942 to 1964 because of the war, partly. And so this, it looks like it could have also been a painting that hailed back to the Depression era when people were living in makeshift tents. You see the tents behind them? And you can see there's a woman holding a baby. They clearly painted a wedding ring on her finger. See the wedding ring? They wanted you to realize this was a woman in a family with her family. She's with a young woman who looks so tired she can't even keep her eyes open. So it's either a painting. Lauren Barton, this was a woman, one of the first women that they actually bought 2 paintings by Lauren Barton during the war era. The women that were left behind decided that we should collect 2 paintings by Lauren Barton. The only person that there's 2 paintings by, actually. So the Bracero, it could also be the Bracero program that they're depicting. So because it was an agricultural community, obviously this would appeal to the students and be an obvious choice. Okay, this is a painting you don't have here. It's by one of 2 artists of color that the students selected, and it didn't travel. I won't talk about it too much, but I like this painting a lot. I didn't like it when I first saw it. And it's by a man named Joe Waano-Gano. He was a Native American who spent over 10 years exploring the natural lighting effects while painting on location under the full moon, which I thought was really an interesting thing. He was also somebody that went into World War II. He fought during World War II in the Air Force, and then when he came back, he made this painting, and the Gardena High School students would have thought this was really interesting, actually. He probably was one of those artists that would come to the annual dinners, and I don't really know what the painting is, but I actually think that it shows 2 warriors who have emerged from the dark and are waiting for their moment to come out of hiding. Or it could refer to the ghost dance, which was a ceremonial circle dance and spiritual movement that was believed to reunite the living with the spirits of the dead. And that kind of makes more sense to me, because they would have helped to keep the Native Americans alive, perhaps, these spirits. So, does that otherworldly light of the moon coming down, are they actually spirits? Maybe they're spirits that are waiting to join the ghost dance with the living. You just don't know, but it's an intriguing painting, I think. So anyway, he was a member of the Cherokee Nation. And here we have a really nice painting that shows what it was like in Los Angeles as more modernist influences were coming in. in the post-war period. So Gardena and Los Angeles were just, the people pouring in now in the post-war period just changed the whole face, because we have the airline, the aerospace industry there now. And so you could get a job really easily there. So people were just coming in by the droves. And Francis de Early, though, he came from Europe in 1939. He had to leave because he was doing anti-Nazi paintings. So he was a target of the Germans, and he had to leave because he was doing anti-war paintings. And he arrived in Southern California in 1944, and USC hired him right away to teach there in the painting department. And this is the Prodigal Son. Artists over the centuries have painted the Prodigal Son, and here he's done something really interesting where he's created almost a nest of love, by the arms surrounding. It's like a nest of the father embracing his son. It's a really beautiful modernist painting, very kind of cubist, but very touching. Okay, now you might wonder, nobody really likes this painting too much, but let me tell you why the students would have chosen it, okay? So, at the time that they were able to choose this painting, Ray Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles was very popular, okay? And in 1953, The Martian Chronicles went to press with a painting by this same artist, okay? So their friends, their families were reading a book that had a painting by this artist. So they would have thought, okay, this is the hot artist, clearly, right? Don't you think? I think that's why they did it. It's also really mysterious and enigmatic. It's called The Remains. And it kind of also has a post-war feel, don't you think? To me it does, which makes it a difficult painting, because we had the atomic bomb, right? I mean, bad times, really. It's consciously or unconsciously, it's sort of an anti-war statement of some sort, you think. Anyway, this would have definitely stood out in the purchase price exhibit. And so I think that's probably why they selected it. It's also at a time when science fiction was just beginning to be associated with surrealism, this kind of surrealist underpinning in paintings. So it was kind of a hot time for that kind of a painting. Okay, so people always wonder, why did they stop collecting? And why did the collection go underground? And how did all that happen? Well, so in 1956, they moved to a new campus, right? We have thousands of people pouring in. We have to have a much bigger high school. They build a much bigger high school, and they don't build anything that was like, they don't build anything like the prior school. There aren't really hallways that have any wall space. The library had no wall space. The auditorium had room for 2 large paintings, and this was the art gallery that they put in. 15 paintings at best of these paintings could fit in there. And they had, kind of over to the far, see that there? Right next to that line in the wall is a little closet where they put all the paintings, basically. Okay. Now there were a few in the offices, for example, but the paintings kind of went underground, and right from the beginning. But they still tried to show as many as they could, and then in the 1970s, the value of the paintings began to skyrocket, and they could no longer really have them in many places and feel safe about it, because that's when California Impressionism began to be known. And so paintings that were worth nothing began to be valuable. So even a painting in an office could cause some concern. But anyway, so they kind of went underground. The school's priorities had to change. They couldn't focus on this art appreciation project anymore. They still, for a while, people knew what the paintings meant. There were still a few up. As far as even 1961, some of the people on the Gardena High School board got to see some of these paintings. But they started, going underground. And until 1991, there was another exhibition prior to this one, when Cal State University at Dominguez Hills, which is near Gardena, organized an exhibition called Painted Light. And that had 31 paintings in it. They got a lot of money from the Keck Foundation to restore some of them. And the exhibition was at Dominguez Hills. I was still at Laguna Art Museum there, or I think if I was, well, anyway, I lectured on the collection then in 1999, but I had already borrowed some paintings over the years from Gardena High School, from that collection, for different exhibitions that I organized. So I kind of already knew about this collection when Simon Chu called me. But right after that Painted Light exhibition, they went back in the closet for the most part. And the only people that got to see them were the alumni, when they would pull a few out every now and then for an annual alumni event or something. So basically, they kind of went back underground again. And that's why when I went to the principal at Gardena High School and started asking, who can I talk to about the history, she said, nobody here knows anything about this at all. And she knew nothing. Isn't that interesting? It's just crazy. So it was great because they were actually, getting in really bad shape in that closet because there was nothing to keep bugs from crawling on them. There was no air conditioning in that closet. They were just jammed in together like sardines. So it was a great thing when the Gardena High School Art Collection Board, they saw to it that this was not going to happen, that they were going to take care of the paintings, they were going to restore all of them, they were going to have an exhibition, they were going to write the history, and they were going to make sure that it didn't just, maybe get sold off or something, or just deteriorate. And this is the great indication of what happened in Gardena. This was a grocery store. Wow. No, a bakery, I'm sorry. This was Van de Kamp's bakery. And Van de Kamp's bakery used to have art. And so did the grocery stores in Gardena, because people were so used to having art in the community and so in love with art that it was kind of a natural part. And I think what happened, although again I don't really know, I think that they would still have these exhibitions, kind of maybe the city would try to organize them, and so all this art would come, but they didn't really know what to do with it. So maybe the art went to grocery stores and to bakeries. I don't know how it ended up there. But this was actually in the newspaper. There would be photographs of this going on in the newspaper. My favorite actually was a picture of a nude in a grocery store with this man looking at it, and his wife is like pulling him away. It's really funny. So anyway, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer it, but I probably said far more than you wanted to hear in the first place. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.